If what we do is changing the public health system, then design is valuable, important, necessary, but nowhere near complete. So good to meet many of you. I haven't seen many of you guys for a while. Rumors of our death are not entirely exaggerated. Many people I've met today, just earlier, said, "Acha, tum log ye CKS wale ho?" So we did rebrand about a year and a half ago as Vihara. And I want to tell you a little bit about what brought us to that point and what kinds of learnings and inquiries we're still involved with. As a very small number of you know, CKS was born in Bangalore in the last decade. A lot of our work was done with different arms of Nokia in the incredible explosion of mobile tech that happened across India in the last decade. It was a period in which one might believe that one could actually work in the private sector and have tremendous impact on society. You can still work for a major multinational, set of multinationals, and tremendous change. Perhaps more change is happening as a result of their penetration into rural markets than almost anything else, at least in that brief kind of shining window of time, about 2002 to 2009. After that, of course, the burning rig of Nokia imploded, exploded, and we had to find other ways of earning our bread. Right around that time, we were in fact invited by the Gates Foundation to begin looking at public health investments that they were about to make in the state of Bihar. And we did some of the earliest formative research and inquiries, ethnographic inquiries into that. And maybe we didn't have a clue then, but that led us to a deeper and deeper involvement in public health, which has really consumed sort of the last decade. We began flirting with this identity Vihara about 4 or 5 years ago. Well, we didn't really formalize it until about a year and a half. And in the process of shifting over from CKS, something that we thought we understood, something that other people also understood, and the design community as well, I would say, probably understood CKS pretty well. We brought Pecha Kucha to India for the first time in 2006. We ran the Doors of Perception conferences in 2003, 2005, 2007. We were deeply integrated into the design community at that time and had cut our teeth, working as an agency for a large multinational, set of large multinational companies. As we began entering into public health, we kind of discovered that everything we knew, much of it didn't apply. A lot of it didn't apply. And there were new rules for this space. And I must admit that in the early days, that led to a certain amount of frustration, anger, confusion, because we thought we knew what the rules were. Well, yes, those rules are good if you're part of a global supply chain and you're involved in product refresh every 2 years. But if your goals have changed, then your means and strategies, ways of working will have to change as well. And so that, in a way, is what I'd like to share with you guys. So here's something like a first cut at major learnings. If what we do is changing the public health system, then design is valuable, important, necessary, but nowhere near complete. Nowhere near the whole thing, nowhere near. And therefore, we've kind of had to keep struggling with that. I hear often from designers that design is motile, design extends, design applies in different sectors and spaces. And while that be true, I think it's helpful for us also to bound and discover where we have fallen off the space of design and we're in a new region, a new discourse altogether. We're often addressing entire systems. We're not exactly designing a product. We're not participating within, let's say, even a value chain, but we're actually trying to transform the value chain itself. And that too, we're doing it, let's say, in a non-disruptive, non-entrepreneurial way. Design leads to impact over the longer term. Who can dispute that? But in the shorter term, believe you me, it's getting in the way of program officers that want to show results over a 12-month cycle, 18-month cycle, 24-month cycle. And design is most irritating, annoying idea that somebody high up has forced on their plate, and they would like you to get out of their office as soon as possible. And so finally, if you're going to really remain committed to design and allied approaches to solving problems, then you've got to be in it for the longer term, and you've got to convert partners little by little, meeting after meeting, time after time. It's a long-term play. You just don't get to transform the health system of India through, forgive me, but kind of a, fuck and run presentation. You go in and have deep relationships. People begin really by distrusting, even hating you, and over time, familiarity breeds some degree of something less than contempt, and you begin to discover that actually you are sutta partners and you're working together. And it's been an incredibly long arc, and it has been deeply, deeply humbling. So I'll tell you as many stories as time allows, and then inshallah we'll chat one-on-one. I'm here for the rest of the day. This work was done by a woman named Divya Datta, originally from NIFT, still a senior consultant at Vihara. It was really elegant, eloquent work that visualized for skeptical decision makers that there is a gap that needs to be addressed. That is to say, there is a way in which vaccine delivery equipment is being taken to the field, which is highly inefficient, which results in stuff being forgotten, very heavy stuff being intentionally broken or intentionally forgotten back at the PHC, where then there is a very cluttered workspace. There are carts, or there are tables without chairs, chairs without tables, just a tarp on the floor. And in all of these conditions, there is data entry, there is biomedical equipment that needs to be manipulated manually, and then there is the arm of a kid that needs to be punctured right, or the butt. So there was not an object that needed designing. There was an argument that we ended up making that for a new kind of object that needed to be commissioned. And that was originally called a vaccine delivery kit, and then it was evolved into something like a A&M workstation because more and more functionalities got accreted onto it. This is the kind of task time analysis that, again, our decision makers sought to convince themselves and others in the hierarchy that such an investment would be called for. Array of stuff that is already being taken. It changes slightly by state to state, but generally it involves certain categories of equipment that then drove the product form. We had actually several different product form concepts which were tested. Our own favorite one actually died along the path, and this other form was preferred by a number of stakeholders on the ground and proved to be actually working as well. We figured out how to manufacture it ultimately in Govindpuri and began commissioning small batches, 200 units at a time, and getting it out there. We had small grant for impact evaluation, and a lot of the claims that we were making, things that we were trying to solve with this artifact, including kind of morale, status, quality of care perception on the part of end beneficiaries, were in fact being impacted. That was what a lot of the evidence from the field trials suggested. And yet, so this is supposed to be a story of success, right? And as far as we were moving through it, we really felt that this was going to be our ticket out of the stratosphere. This is going to go all the way. And in every way that I think a decision maker would want it to work, it did work. And we were trying to volleyball it across to the other side. And we, in the process, realized there's nobody on the other side. I mean, our instincts framed by a company like Nokia is trying to get us out the door as fast as possible so that their internal teams can take over what we gave them so that they can productize, so they can go to market. That's their job. So we asked repeatedly ecosystem players, who's going to take this to the field? And either no one, or maybe you are. And we were in no way, I think, kind of, I don't know, conceptually or operationally, psychologically prepared to do that. We couldn't understand what kind of business model would allow us to go and start manufacturing and distributing this, it was really, honestly, defeating. This is a period around 2016 or so that we were struggling with this problem. As happens, other problems came our way, we got involved with other work, and this kind of fell by the wayside, and it went into a kind of stasis, and where we didn't know what, if ever, we were going to do about it. And we're back, in a way. We're back in the market, we're back on the trail. This woman named Nida Yamin, who has a background in public health, who's working with us. And she has been in aspirational districts in 4 or 5 different states, giving these kinds of presentations to district magistrates. And there is traction. I mean, people see the value of this, and people want something like this to be implemented. There are many lessons here, I think, for us. One of them is that the change is just glacial. From the time that we came up with this and we were like ready to go, to the point at which maybe India's ecosystem was ready to receive things like this, there was a gap. We were probably in the wrong state. There are more progressive states like Rajasthan and Madhya Pradesh where this is getting a lot better reception. And we had, in some ways, just to bear with it and back ourselves and try to get it out there. And that is, in fact, kind of what is going on. So this is, eventually, I believe, now going to see the light of day and actually go to scale. Okay. So let me move on to another story, which is live. It's a 2019 story based right here in Maharashtra. So we were commissioned by Reckitt Benckiser's CSR arm to work with a new consortium that includes several other players, Plan International, VSTF, something Maharashtra specific, to look at these 2 tribal districts on the northern edge of Maharashtra. These are adjacent to Madhya Pradesh on one end and Gujarat on the other end. Now, I have worked in tribal districts a long time in the past, like almost 20 years ago now. And in some ways, we already believed we had a sense of the challenges here. Specifically, we were looking at malnutrition and the kind of social causes of malnutrition. In some ways, the hypothesis that was given to us is that tribal languages are different, tribal cosmologies are different, tribal societal architecture is different. There are tribal influencers like Bhumkas, other religious leaders, who are kind of non-standard to what is called the mainstream, or you would say basically Savarna hierarchies. And as a result of this, the state is not easily able to penetrate, there is a breakdown of trust, and we are not able to provide them services. I think a lot of that may be true. I don't want to dismiss all of it. But not all of that really accounts for the challenge that we saw when we went to these places, in that they are run beautiful and they are abundant. And in fact, you would say nature is providing well for these people. They are, in many ways, inaccessible. Roads aren't yet built. There are canals and lakes and waterways that divide these people from the rest of the state. As kind of we had encountered way in the past as well, these edge districts, of which there are about 60, are non-standard in culture. They're on the edge of different states, very far from state capitals. In many cases, you're getting mobile reception of a different state than you're actually living in. And that often means that actually it's much easier for you to go to a PHC in the neighboring state than to go to a PHC across the canal, across the river in your own state. But the federal architecture is such that you are not really allowed to avail of those services when you're across state boundaries. I mean, many cases you have problems across district boundaries, forget about state boundaries. So remoteness and infrastructure failures are all real. The non-standard culture and cosmology is real. But we are still scraping and scraping away as to why a community that has such abundance, that enjoys forest foods, that has kitchen gardens, why are they suffering malnutrition? And eventually, I mean, it's quite late and it's a bit of an embarrassing story. The field partners went off to try to serve them and they couldn't find them. They were not there. And we're like, where are these guys? The entire family, from everybody who's like 2 years old to anybody of working age, like 50, 60 years old, travels, migrates out of the state into an adjacent state as construction workers, sharecropper, etc. So the entire village community is simply not there 3 or 4 months of the year. And they've gone off into Gujarat. And they're just not in Maharashtra anymore. And this kind of basic information was not available to many district level administrators and decision makers. So you have a situation where, in a sense, the administrative logic of the entire country is inimical to serving these guys in their period of greatest need. That is to say, when they're traveling, everything plummets, right? Their ability to forage for food or have access plummets. And so in a way, they are in a scarcity situation while they're sharecropping. They make some cash money and come back to the abundant villages that we find them in. So the more obvious solutions that you might recommend, is that they kind of become temporary Gujarat state residents while they're there, are all blocked. So now you're kind of working against these constraints that there will be no appeal to. So there is now discussions about, in some ways, how to create care packages that they can use while they're traveling, how to have remote engagement back in Maharashtra, even while they're in Gujarat or in Madhya Pradesh. So use apps, use digital media, ways of, in a sense, having a kind of remote relationship to these state citizens who are not actually within the state for that period of time. Okay, I'd like to talk about this, I think, pretty challenging piece of work that occupied us for 2 years. And challenging because the brief to us was incredibly difficult. We were told that kids under 5 are being malnourished, succumb to pneumonia and diarrhea, get hospitalized, some cases even get cured temporarily, go home and die. Or by the time they show up to the hospital, they are already on the jaws of death. They have been in this morbid situation so long that the disease is now going to mark itself on the body permanently. The child will be stunted, maybe cognitively disabled, will never reach its full potential because of the duration that this edge condition has been playing. The guy has been sick and well and sick and well just on the edge, and in that way has compromised his health and maybe potentially long-term well-being. So the challenge to us was to find these kids before they are clinically vulnerable. Right? So before they get hospitalized, before they are actually diseased to the point of being acknowledged as being severely malnourished, can we discover them before? All right? So it's a great, difficult challenge. If you can figure out how to discover them before, you will really have made a dent. And we went looking, and the first answers we got were really confusing. At some level, we said, yaar, dekho to sahi, ye log rehte kaise hain? Life in Kacha and life in Semi-Pakka is, in a way, like permanent camping, right? Permanently, the environment is assaulting your health in that you're playing in dirt and you're possibly urinating on the edge of the boundary of your plot. Defecation without hand washing, no hand washing before going down to meals, certain amount of kind of no refrigeration, meals being served late, host of challenges in the way that families were being forced to live as a result of the infrastructure of the home. So our first set of thoughts was around infrastructure, but as we scratched this a little bit deeper, we began realizing that given the same infrastructure, families are living differently within their infrastructure. So there is something around the behavior of the family, notwithstanding the infrastructure, which seems to be allied with better and worse outcomes. So now, in addition to the physical form of the home, we were interested in inquiring into behaviors within the home. Right? And in some cases, the boundaries between those two things are quite subtle. So we studied, more than 60 families, and in a way, quite intimately, quite deeply, going into their home and participating in meals and documenting media and documenting safe and unsafe spaces, water management, childcare, health seeking, health escalation, finances, health finances, things like that. So just to pluck two of these cases, families that on the surface appear similar turn out to be quite different in terms of how family decisioning and family processes are unfolding. We tried to identify through this process some of the key determinants of child health, or if you like, in fact, child well-being, or the absence of vulnerability, etc. So, and in some of these cases, we had to kind of be quite dumb and naive and ask basic questions. How many of the families we are working with could be said to be suffering extreme material poverty? In other cases, we saw that there were not enough parents for the number of children, not enough support structures outside and beyond the parental units. We saw that there was a lot of out-migration, or men that was hanging around, that unemployed, were drunk or doing substance abuse, or in other ways kind of present but absent. Some cases there was excessive structure. And only in a few cases you just say that everything is going right for the family, but they don't really have it together in terms of what are healthful behaviors. So these are some of the key factors that were determined through ethnography. And through this, we attempted to create a draft typology of families, where you would say we're not really looking for presence or absence of the factors, but modulation. Exactly how does it play out? And this became a proposition to a number of development partners in Bihar and later Uttar Pradesh, that can they use this framework to start thinking about the families that they are looking to serve? And I have to tell you, the first reaction was extremely negative, as you might have imagined. I don't know, have you imagined? People resisted this greatly for a number of reasons, including phenomena that we now discuss in mainstream design, which is that people like the old interface better. That's just how things are. There is a degree of inertia in mainstream consumers and decision makers. We went out and tried to prove that this stuff exists, and you cannot blanket characterize an entire village or an entire block as being disprivileged. You will not be able to arrive at these same results by caste, demographic, or other kinds of cuts. That you will have to look at the internal functioning and the family dynamics to figure out the different kinds of need and vulnerability that families have. And so we were encouraging our development partners, including the state, to acquire a perspective on the community they're trying to serve that would be characterized something like this. So that somebody working, an ASHA worker working in a community would be able to categorize the families that she aims to serve. Now, it's one thing that people wanted to learn typologies. It's another that we find in the development sector a tremendous amount of skepticism about the ability of the health system to actually absorb innovation. And again, I'm happy to report that that's changing. But the default assumption is, ye log kitna kya kar lenge? How will they absorb typologies? How will they think typologically? And we had to remind them that a lot of these typologies and this way of thinking had actually come through a user-centered process that included service providers and ASHA workers and A&Ms who had actually given these kinds of insights to us. So it's in a way that this way of thinking is already out there. We're just formalizing and maybe being able to standardize and scale this kind of way of thinking. So our job suddenly became to show that typological work can happen at the field level. So we had to build tools and collect evidence that frontline workers will actually be able to detect the specific typology that a family falls into. So the tool you're looking at now, I'll not maybe go into the details of it, but it is an interactive game that allows the frontline worker to use this field aid to determine a typology of a given family, and over time, playing the game enough, can throw away the aid memoir afterwards. In that, they would have played the game, internalized the logic, and then be able to use it on their own. That's the logic of this little interactive game or aid. And there's a whole series of other interventions that we created about once you realize that there is some sort of deficiency within the family, how do you address it, and different teaching tools as well as interactive tools that can be used by the service provider in relationship to the family. And so I just want to emphasize some things here that ज़माना था agency के कारोबार में that if you convince your PO, well, that's not even the right word, if you convince your client, the owner of the project, that whatever you're doing is valuable, you're done. I mean, am I wrong? Isn't that how agencies work? basically relationship sales to some head of design, head of marketing, unke niche hierarchy mein, there is an operational hierarchy within which if you can speak a similar language and get them drunk and get them convinced that this is good, then they will keep buying your output. Well, this is how it used to work for us anyway. In the change-making space, there is a entailment on us that I used to resist, and I try not to resist it anymore. I try to internalize it. As you can see, I'm still struggling, which is that it's not enough for anybody to have a gut that this is working. The narrative is not adequate. You actually need to give the evidence through trials at various scales. Certainly, even after trials and evidence, people may not be convinced. But if you're trying to convince them of your intervention without that data set and without those trials, good luck. The time for that is over. Because of the workings of organizations like JPAL and the ascendancy of the scientific state, there has to be data around every kind of innovation and intervention. I'm going to zip through this in the interests of time. These are different strategies for actually going in and learning from existing best practices and trying to get them standardized within homes so that everybody is living in a smarter way, even if their home infrastructure has not been improved. These are simple, some cases naive, but straightforward solutions that do not require a top-down approach, but really require a peer-enabled approach. And we are, in fact, experimenting with some of this in Bihar and Uttar Pradesh with PCI and other partners. But what I want to say about this is that this is commonsensical, necessary, and extremely hard work. There's no guarantee that there is actually an appetite for it, because it is the kind of hard work that requires you to go deep into people's homes and transform them, and the appetite and the willingness for that, well, it will come, but it's an uphill struggle and a long-term struggle. So I want to close out by just reinforcing these thoughts around partnership. When we stopped, thinking of ourselves as working within the mobile sector, Vihara really splintered. And I've talked to you entirely about the work we've done in public health over the last 7-8 years. There's another part of Vihara that does acceleration and impact investing and things like that. For both this part of Vihara and that part of Vihara, facilitation, dialogue, conversation has been essential, right? So convenings of this nature at smaller scales, larger scales, different kinds of focused dialogues, breakouts, all of these have been absolutely critical to moving the dial, right? To getting people to a sense that we're all in this together, right? Conversations after conversation after conversation, in DM after DM's office to get those conversions, and a lot of, I would say, humility. Certainly in my case, I would say there's a tremendous amount of humility, a lot of ego nashta, in order to be able to pay attention to the challenges that our partners have, the ways in which they characterize problems, the way that they think about problems, to be able to absorb that and to feel like we are a part of this process, so that all the criticisms we have of the public health space equally and necessarily apply to us, as well as applying to those who are already in it before we showed up. So maybe I'll just try to gloss these ideas a little bit. Whatever we have left behind in this decade, I would say is surely not essential to design. And whatever we still work with and retain with us, perhaps is. Design is the highest order of consciousness, presence, reflection, problem solving, pattern making. It's a very high way of being. And when we discover ourselves in a milieu like this, we can see that that intensity, uttejana, which is distributed amongst all of you, is real. Compare that with a partners meet in Bihar, and I promise you, like Plato's cave, you got to get out there and spend a lot of time with non-designers to appreciate the fellow traveling that each of us does. Now, I wasn't an NID graduate, and I'm part of this Ekalavya tradition of design in India for the last 15 or 20 years. But even so, I see that in my organization, the leaders are all designers. All the core thinking is really being done by people who are trained in one way or another in design and have extremely strong visual communications and analytic, synthetic capabilities. That said, there are an array of things beyond this: straightforward management, straightforward value chain management, supply chain logistics, behavioral science, behavioral economics, where we have a lot to learn and a lot of partnerships to make with formal disciplines and ways of working in order to be maximally effective. Thanks.